This is the third recitation for Principles of Macroeconomics. I will solve the problems in problem set 3 in this recitation. But before going into the questions, I just want to make a brief summary about what is GDP, its components, and then I will introduce to GNP. Then we'll go into the questions to solve problems you might encounter in midterm or pub quizzes. So GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a specific country in a specific year. This specific year is generally 1 year. We calculate GDP for 1 year. And specific country means you have to pay attention to where the product is produced. For instance, if it is produced in Turkey, no matter who produced it, it will go into the Turkish GDP. For example, if a German car manufacturer goes to Turkey, builds factory and produces cars, then this will count in the Turkish GDP. Germany's GDP will be not affected since it is not produced in Germany. So GDP, we can say that GDP is about location. Nationality doesn't matter. What matters is where the final goods and services are produced. So you might ask, what is final? We say that final goods and services, but what is final? We have to distinguish goods between final and intermediate. For instance, if you go to supermarket and buy a chocolate for consuming, for eating, this is considered as a final good because you get the good, you consume it, and you don't use it to produce anything else. So this is what we call a final good. But if a chef goes to a market and buys a chocolate to make cake, so he buys chocolate to make another product. He buys it to make chocolate cakes, for example. This chocolate is considered as intermediate good. Let's say that the price of chocolate is $5. Then if you as a consumer go to market and buy the chocolate, then Turkish GDP would be high by $5. But if a chef goes to market and buys a chocolate, then Turkish GDP will not be higher since this is an intermediate good. When this chef buys chocolate and makes it into a chocolate cake and then sells this cake, let's say that this cake's price is $20, then since the cake is a final good, when a consumer buys the cake, then Turkish GDP would be higher by $20. So we don't count intermediate goods into the GDP. Let's go to the components of GDP. GDP mainly consists of consumption, which is the biggest, which contributes to biggest, and investment, government spending, plus this is exports minus imports, which is called net export. This term is called net exports, so it consists export minus imports. Consumption, as we said earlier, is like buying food or buying clothes or paying your rent. This is all in the consumption side. Investment is like buying factories, buying machines to increase your production. This is called investment. But an important thing to make here is that buying stocks or bonds is not an investment. So we don't, as economists, we don't consider them as investment. Only investment we consider is the buying machines, production, anything that increases production capacity of a factory. Government spending is like can be considered as national defense or building infrastructure, roads, etc. Exports, minus imports. So this will give us the total GDP. And we calculated GDP as from expenditure side, but you can also count it from income side since given a year, total income must be equal to the total spending. But since it is easier to calculate GDP from the expenditure sides, economists usually use this, but you can find how to calculate it from income side from the slides or the book. Now let's come to the GNP, Gross National Product. Gross national product is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a given period. So this is the same as the definition of GDP, nothing is changed. This given period is again usually 1 year. But the difference is that it is owned by a country's citizens regardless of production place. So in this case, we don't care where the product is produced. We just care what is the nationality of the producer. So if again, let's give this example. If a German car manufacturer goes to Turkey and builds factory here to produce cars, then the market value of that cars is not included in the Turkish GNP. It will not increase Turkish GNP because the owner is German. But Germany's GNP would be higher in this case since the owner is German. How to calculate GNP? Once you calculate GDP, it is actually easy. So I suggest you first calculate GDP and then from there you can calculate the GNP. Once you calculate GDP, you just have to add net factor income, and this is the net income from abroad, so the money you take from abroad. For example, if a Turkish apartment builder goes to Azerbaijan and builds apartments there, then the money from selling that apartment would increase the Turkish GNP. So this is the net income from we gain from abroad minus net income outflow to foreign countries, like in the case of German car manufacturer. The money goes to Germany, so we subtract that from the net income from abroad. Okay, let's start with our first question. It says, according to the expenditure method, specify whether transactions given below affect GDP. If so, in what direction and which component of GDP will be affected? I mentioned that if we were to calculate GDP from the expenditure side, these are the components: consumption, investment, government spending, exports minus imports. So we will indicate what of the components are changing, and then we'll indicate whether GDP is increasing or decreasing. First, you purchase a new hoodie from Ottu'dan. In this case, you are purchasing a final good because once you get the hoodie, you will not use it to produce something else. So this is a final good and you consume it as a consumer. So consumption will increase and GDP will increase likewise. Second, your dad buys chocolate to make a cake at home. In this case, your dad buys chocolate as a final good because even though he makes cakes, even though he uses this chocolate to make something else, he is not making it for the market. He's not gonna sell the cake, so we will not consider the chocolate as an intermediate good. We will consider the chocolate as final good. So the value of chocolate will increase the consumption, so GDP will increase. What happens to the value of cake? Well, value of cake will be not considered in the GDP because, as I said, it is not made for profit. It is not made for sale. 3. Seeing the increase in Dogecoin, you buy $100 worth of them. Although this seems like an investment, financial investment, we don't count financial investments as we don't consider financial investments as investments. So as economists, this is not an investment, so the GDP will not affect it. 4. You sell your house to a friend at a higher price than you bought. Well, this again seems like a consumption, but this value of remember from the beginning, I said that GDP calculates the production in a given year. This house was not produced. This house is second-hand, so because you're selling to another friend, this house was produced, let's say, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we considered the value of the house in the GDP when it was first produced. But it is already existing. Let's suppose that we are 10 years after that, 10 years after the production. Since we already considered its value 10 years ago, now we will not consider its value in the GDP, whether it is sold at a higher or lower price. its value was considered 10 years ago. After that, after its first production, we will not consider. So whether you sell to a friend, it will not count in the GDP, so the GDP will not change. 5. A domestic dealer purchases phones from a manufacturer in South Korea. This will increase imports, this will increase M, so GDP will decrease. 6. You purchase a 2018 car from a friend. This is again like the case in the house example. This was produced, let's say, suppose we are in 2021. This was produced 3 years ago, so we counted its production value when it was first produced 3 years ago, so we will not count any transaction, any value from a transaction now, so GDP will not change in this case. 7. A domestic firm produces sugar and ships them to Germany. We produce it and give them to another country. Exports will increase, and as a result, GDP will increase. Next, a company buys 3D printer to use it in their office. Well, now this is an investment because they invest in an item which will increase their production capacity. So this is an economic investment. It will increase I and it will increase GDP. An Italian buys salt from the store to use it in pasta. Then he sells it in his own restaurant. So he is using the salt to produce something else to sell. In this case, salt is an intermediate good. We don't count its value in the GDP. What we count is when the pasta is, if he manages to sell the pasta, the value of pasta will increase the consumption of a country. So we will just consider the value of pasta since this is a final good and salt is an intermediate good. A municipality starts a road construction in a city. This is a government spending. It will increase G and it will also increase GDP. Your grandma makes you a sweater. Well, if your grandma sells it to you, then it will increase the consumption. But assuming that she gives you as a gift, this is, since this will not give rise to a market transaction, it will not affect the GDP. We are in the question 2. It seems a little bit long. There exist 3 firms in an economy. Company X is producing 100 TL worth of cotton, which it sells to company Y. Then X, in this production process, X gives 60 TL as wages and 10 TL as tax to government. Y takes the cotton from X and use it to produce 250 TL worth of clothes. Then Y takes the clothes, Y sells these clothes to Z, company Z. In the production process, Y gives 70 TL as wages and 10 TL as tax. Then Z takes the clothes and produces 400 TL worth of dress, and dresses are sold to customers. And in this process, Z gives 80 TL as wages and 20 TL as taxes to government. In the first question, it says find GDP using final goods approach. So in calculating GDP, since it is much easier, I always used final goods approach, which is just looking the final good and taking its value as the increase in GDP. But there are other ways, as you see in the questions. There is a final goods approach, there is income approach, and there is value added approach, and we will see them in turn. Well, you already know the first question, how to calculate GDP using final goods approach. We look and try to find what is the final good. In this case, it is the dresses, because dresses are sold to customers. Other items are sold to companies to produce something else. So final goods price is 400 liras. So we just write the value of the final good, which is 400. Now let's come to the second part of the question. We will compute the GDP using income approach. There are typically 3 types of incomes. Incomes received by the owners, profits. incomes received by the laborers, wages, and income received by the government are taxes. So we will compute each one in turn. Then we will sum these up, and it should give us the same result as we found. So the company X's profit is 100 liras, the sale of the cotton, minus the labor cost minus the taxes. Y's profit is 250, the price of the clothes, minus the intermediate goods. So you have to subtract the price of the cotton from their sale price, minus labor cost minus taxes. And this profit is the price of the sale of the dress, minus intermediate good that it uses, minus labor cost minus taxes. And when we sum these all up, the profits will be equal to 150. When we come to wages, X gives 60 TL as wages, Y gives 70, and Z gives their labor 80 liras, and when we sum these up, it's 210. As taxes, X gives 10 lira to government, Y gives 10 lira, and Z gives 20 lira to government, which will equal to 40. When we sum these all up, it will equal to 400, which is the same result as we found. Come to our last approach to finding GDP. It says find this country's GDP by using value-added approach. This is the last approach to calculate GDP. In this case, we consider how much price does each company gives to the item. So how much value they are producing. Let's calculate value added by company X. Well, company X, we assume that company X uses no inputs. Well, this is not realistic because you cannot make cottons out of air. But let's suppose that we make cottons out of air. So company X uses no inputs and makes 100 TL worth of good. So it produces value to society 100 liras. Then this company Y takes this 100 lira worth of item goods and makes it into a 250 liras worth of goods. So we subtract the difference and we find 150 liras. So Y adds 150 lira value to the goods. And finally Z gets the dress clothes from company Y and makes into a dress. So we just again subtract the difference in value. So we again find 150 lira. So Z made added value of 150. When we sum these all up, it's again 400. This exercise is made. We solved this exercise to show you that no matter what approach you take, you will always find the same value. So you can use whatever you like. Question 3. If the natural rate of unemployment is 4%, what is the actual rate of unemployment if output is 2% below potential? You know what natural rate of unemployment means? It is the state that when there is no cyclical unemployment, because cyclical unemployment is related to the condition of economy. If the economy is in a recession, then the cyclical unemployment rate goes up and we are no longer in the natural rate of unemployment. Potential GDP is also related to that. When there is no cyclical unemployment, so if the actual rate of unemployment is equal to natural rate of unemployment, we reach the potential of the economy, hence the potential of the GDP. So it is straightforward. You learned what Okun's law means. It states that when unemployment rate is 1% above the natural rate of unemployment, output drops by 2%. This is also the case in the question. Our output is 2% below potential, so that means actual rate of unemployment is 1% above the nature rate of unemployment. So if the nature rate of unemployment is 4%, that means actual rate of unemployment is 1% above that, 5%. Question 4, calculate GNP. We are giving consumption, investment, government spending, exports, and imports. The additional thing is the net foreign factor income, which I talked about in the beginning of the video. It is simply the factor payments from abroad, factor payments we receive from abroad, minus factor payments we give to abroad. So the money we give to foreigners. To calculate GNP, I said first calculate GDP. To calculate GDP, you sum the consumption, investment, government spending, export, and you subtract that from the imports. The good thing is that once you calculate GDP, formula of GNP is quite easy. You just calculate GDP with the net foreign factor income, which is minus 30. So once you calculate the GDP, which is quite easy, you subtract it from the 30 here. Or multiple part of the problem set from here. Question 1. According to the Okun's law, when cyclical unemployment changes from negative 3% to negative 2%, the output gap changes from measured relative to the potential output. So what is the output gap? Output gap is the drift from the potential output. Let's suppose that we are producing 3% below the potential GDP. That means that our output gap is 3%. So let's remember that what Okun's law tells us is that when unemployment goes up by 1%, GDP drops by 2%. But this GDP must be unnatural, so it must be cyclical unemployment. In the initial case, our cyclical unemployment was negative 3%, so we multiply that by 2. So that means our potential GDP is below 6%, so our output gap is negative 6%. Then we come to a relatively good state because cyclical unemployment goes down. It is now negative 2%. We again multiply that by 2. Then it means that our output gap is now negative 4%. So the answer is A. Question 2. If substantially more foreign money is invested in Ireland than Irish citizens have invested abroad, then one likely to expect Irish. Let's remember the distinction between GDP and GNP. While GDP measures the total value of produced goods and services within a country, within a location, GNP measures produced goods and services produced by nationality, by a country's citizens. In this case, production in Ireland is mostly through foreign money and foreign producers, so we might expect that GDP of Ireland is greater than its GNP, so the answer is C. Given the table, aggregate income equals, so the question asks us calculate GDP from the income side. We actually did that in the one of our questions, and we summed the profits, wages, and taxes. But in this case, it was that wages were disposable wage, so employees paid no taxes in their wages, so we consider taxes as income to government. But in this case, compensation to employees is their total income, and they pay taxes as expenditure, so we don't consider tax as an income in this case, we consider that as an expenditure. So to calculate aggregate income, we sum profits, rents, compensation to employees, interest, and that is equal to 900. The answer is C. We don't count taxes and transfer payments since they are expenditure. Question 4. Mert is an artist. He purchases canvas, paints, brushes, and accessories for $75. He sells one of his original paintings to an art gallery for $1,500, which in turn sells it to an art lover for $4,500. How much value does the gallery add? So we consider the value added approach to GDP. What is the final good? It is the sale of the painting for $4,500. Then we subtract it from the input it uses. The painting from Mert, which was valued at $1,500. We subtract them, and the answer is $3,000. C. Question 5. Maryland's government publishes a gross national happiness measure that embraces everything from protecting national resources to promoting a strong national culture and ensuring democratic government. This approach to measuring progress is similar to the approach that is used in measuring. GDP only measures the production in a country, so it doesn't consider the aspects of democratic institution, justice system, income distribution, and democratic institutions, and so on. So some economists and social scientists believe that we have to make a better development index for measuring a country's well-being and its citizens' well-being. So recently, more people are agreeing to this, and Human Development Index is one of the examples of that. One of the examples of scientists to trying to have a better understanding of the development. So the answer is this, because Maryland's government did something like that. They considered other aspects than just production. Question 6. Aggregate output is the same as. We said that total value of the output must be same with the total income. So the aggregate income is the same with aggregate output. The total quantity of goods and services produced in an economy in a given period of time. This is the definition of GDP. So this is again equal to aggregate output of a country. Aggregate quantity supplied. This is again the total quantity supplied is the total output. They are just synonyms. D, all of the above. The answer is D, because all of definitions are correct. Question 7. Phillips curve relates the inflation rate to. Remember that Phillips curve related inflation to the unemployment rate. It said that when unemployment rate goes up, inflation rate decreased. Because when unemployment rates goes up, people have less money to spend, so their demand for goods and services decreases, and through the mechanisms of demand and supply that you learned in microeconomics, the prices go down, so that decreases inflation. In the other case, when unemployment goes down, so people relatively have more money to spend, their aggregate demand goes up, that increases the prices, and inflation goes up. So the answer is A. Gap between actual GDP and its trend value and the difference between actual unemployment rate and its equilibrium value is called. This is the definition of Okun's law, because the equilibrium value of the unemployment rate is the natural rate of unemployment. If our actual unemployment rate is above the natural rate of unemployment, that means there is cyclical unemployment. So we are in a recession, and that will decrease our potential GDP. So this is Okun's law. Question 9. The value added by the automobile dealer equals. In the table, we are given a production process of a car. In the first stage, a steel mill is produced, then it's sold to auto manufacturer. Auto manufacturer sells it to auto dealer, and auto dealer sells car to final consumer. So we'll calculate the value added by the automobile dealer. Automobile dealer sells customer a product valued at $25,000, and we subtract that from the input it uses, which is $18,000, and this will give us the value that auto dealer creates, which is $7,000. Question 10. The value of each automobile in gross domestic product equals. So it asks us the value of the final good. We look and try to determine which is the final good. final good is the good that is consumed by the consumer. So auto dealer sells the final good, which is valued at $25,000. The answer is D. Which of the following are not considered part of the government purchases? Welfare benefits, teachers' salaries paid by the government, a tank purchased by the government, a bridge purchased by the government. Remember that to include something in the GDP, it must give some good and service to the consumer. In the teacher's salaries, teacher gives some service to the government by giving education. So this is a government purchase. A tank purchased by the government. This is again a good uh, that is purchased by the government. A bridge purchased by the government. This is again a good. But welfare benefits, it's not exactly a good or service because the government benefits nothing from it. It's just as for the benefit of the poor people. So we cannot actually put it in the GDP measure because it doesn't give rise to a good or service. Refer to the table below. Suppose that Metoland produces only 4 goods and services: ranch sauce, mayonnaise, tomatoes, and ketchup. Assume one half of the tomatoes are used in making the ketchup and the other half of the tomatoes are purchased by households. Using the information in the above table, nominal GDP for Metoland equals. So we are going to consider the final goods value. Ranch sauce is a final good, so we multiply it 40 by the price. Mayonnaise is again final good. We multiply quantity by price. Tomatoes, in this case, half of the tomatoes are final goods and half of are intermediate goods. So we only consider 1,000 of them in the quantity and we multiply 1,000 with the price. Ketchup, all of the ketchups are final goods. We again multiply all quantity by the price and the result should give 6,400. Last question, refer to the table below. Suppose that Tomorrowland produces only 4 goods and services: hoodies, sweatpants, coffee drinks, and coffee beans. Assume all of the coffee beans are used in the production of coffee drinks. So we are not going to consider coffee beans in the GDP because they are not final good. Using the information in the above table, nominal GDP for the Tomorrowland equals. Hoodies are final good. We multiply quantity by the price. Sweatpants are the final goods, quantity multiplied by price. Coffee drinks are final goods, quantity times price. Coffee beans, we are not consider any of the coffee beans. They are because they are all intermediate goods. They go into the production of the coffee drinks. So when you sum these all up, it should give 8,750. And this is the end of the recitation. If you have